People learn in school and media. I know from 50 years in the news business, naturalist, materialist legends. They're just repeated again and again by people who never go back to the original and find out what happened. So an awful lot of what you hear ain't so. Remember what they used to say? I don't know if this is the same proverb as I grew up with. It's not what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know that ain't so. So let's have a look at many of the naturalist myths that just ain't so. Now, let me see how you, next slide. All righty. I'm going to run through 10 of these myths, and what I've done is I've sent Boris the text of my talk, so you don't need to take notes. If I said it, chances are it's there. If not, you can always get back to me. Okay. These are myths, right? Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, the troll, everybody knows they're myths, but there are lots of myths people don't know myths. All right. Let's start with a few that I grew up with. You may have grown up with different myths, but I bet you can substitute one from your background for everyone I can come up with. So let's see. And all right. I don't know if you've ever heard of a researcher named Stanley Milgram, an American, and he did studies showing that average Americans in the 1950s would torture someone if authorities told them to do so. Now, when I first heard about this, when I was editing textbooks in the late 1980s, I was suspicious. It just wasn't like anybody I grew up with, and Canadians are not that dissimilar from Americans. Most people would just leave and quietly call the police, right? That's about what would happen. But academics just loved stuff like this. The message was people need control from academics, of course, because otherwise awful things like World War II would happen again. Again, I was suspicious because that just didn't work out. A Canadian academic in particular had developed this fascism scale. And according to him, you were at risk of becoming a fascist if you thought that a lot was going on among the higher ups in society, among the leadership, that they wouldn't tell you about. Now, I remember when I first heard this, I burst out laughing because that was about the same time as Watergate. I don't know if anybody here knows about or remembers Watergate in the United States, but basically, yeah, a lot was going on that nobody was telling you about. So it was simply a measure of sophistication to realize that would be true and had nothing to do with fascism, but that was what the academics needed to believe, okay? So that cured me of thinking that these people are especially good judges. All right, let's move on to another myth. By the way, Milgram's research was extensively re-examined, and it was found that generally speaking, what he was fronting wasn't true. Generally speaking, there was a lot of opposition to torturing someone just because the authorities told you to, which is about what I would have expected. Okay, but it was popular, believe me. Okay. Now, again, if you grew up when and where I did, you'd know about Kitty Genovese. She was a woman living in New York City who'd been stabbed to death by this troubled individual. And the story from the New York Times was that 38 people watched it and nobody did anything. Now, some of us had a hard time believing that. Well, again, many years later, long after the damage was done by these claims, people went into it and researched it because, owing to the fact that it was a big public uproar, there was lots of documentation. And it turned out that that wasn't true. Lots of people had tried to help Genovese. The trouble was they were equipped, inexperienced private citizens, not people from the emergency services or anything like that. They didn't know what to do, so what they did didn't work. One detail I remember could well be true. People jammed the phone lines to the police. So it took the police a while to arrive because their phones were jammed. That could happen in those days, right? If enough people were trying to reach the same switchboard. So anyway, so that's what really happened. But you see, what was the big message? The big message was the government needs to run everything because private citizens won't do anything to help others. Not true, at least certainly not then and there, and not in my own experience. I remember when the Concorde jet went off the runway in Toronto. This was about 15 years ago. A whole bunch of cars in the left lane simply parked on the strip of the road, Highway 401 it's called, beside the left lane, and people crossed the barrier and went in to put the passengers in their cars and drive them back to the airport. And nobody told them to do that, they just did it. So again, this sort of thing made me suspicious of social psychology, social science, claims about how people behave. I'm not saying nobody ever behaves the way they say, but you should not assume that it's true because they're saying it. All right, 3. Perceptions of cleanliness affect moral judgments. Again, widely believed, not replicated. You can see what was driving such a belief. People are looking for irrational origins for traditional moral beliefs. So, of course, they find them. I mean, you look hard enough, you find it, right? But the claims were not replicated. But I wouldn't be very surprised if you still see them in some social psychology textbooks, because this stuff takes a long time to get out of the textbooks. Don't believe me? Have a look at what happens with Darwinian claims about evolution that have been shown not to be correct. And a guy I know named Jonathan Wells has done a lot of work on this. These claims just keep getting drop-kicked from one edition of the book to the next. It's long refuted, never discarded. And, watch out for this kind of thing. If it doesn't sound like people you know, be a bit suspicious. That's all I would say. And I've been in this business a long time. All righty now, where are we now? We're at Phineas Gage. You may have heard of him. That American railway worker who a tamping rod actually went through his head. You know what a tamping rod is? It's a rod for pushing down explosives, or that's the way it was done in those days. Well, the rod blew out of the hole and went through his head. Amazingly, he lived. Now, the big social psychology story was his personality dramatically changed. He'd been a nice guy, and then he became foul-mouthed and his personality completely changed. Lecture after lecture in Social Psychology 101 tells us his personality changed. And that proves that personality is simply a material thing. It has nothing to do with the mind or human choices or anything like that. Okay, here's the problem. Phineas Gage was just one of thousands of guys working on the railroad. There are lots and lots of songs in North America, I've been working on the railroad. Okay, millions of them maybe, more likely hundreds of thousands. All right, nobody knew very much about him. His personality after the tamping rod was described by a physician who was looking after him who, so far as we know, had no access to what he was like before. For all I know, he was a foul-mouthed bastard beforehand. There'd be nothing unusual about that among guys working on the railroad. Anyway, the upshot was, after a few years of stumbling around, he emigrated to Chile in the real story, not the lecture room story. And he drove a stagecoach in Chile for a number of years. Later, he succumbed to a massive epileptic seizure. No surprise. It was a surprise he'd even lived, right? But the thing about Gage was, I remember a friend pointing this out. Do you realize if he was driving a stagecoach, he was working with horses? If you want to get another kick in the head, try being crazy while working with horses. Because horses kick first and ask questions later, right? Actually, they don't ask questions. It was unlikely that he was as crazy as they said if he managed to survive driving a stagecoach for 8 years. And then, as I say, he came back to the States, succumbed to epilepsy. But anyway, the real story is complicated. It's not neat enough to be popular science. Popular science is he was this nice guy, and then after the tamping rod incident, he suddenly became a dreadful person. No, didn't happen that way. Okay, but that's what students believe. That's the main thing to see. The people who heard that, they didn't hear the whole story. They just heard that. All right, now here's another good one from North America and why there need to be big crackdowns by government, okay? The Mars invades panic of 1938. You know, everybody freaked out because of a radio broadcast of Orson Welles's story about an invasion from Mars. The trouble is, it never happened. I mean, neither the invasion from Mars nor the panic actually happened. There were a few benighted people out in the country who took it seriously, but the overwhelming majority of people who heard snatches of the broadcast realized that this was just some show or other on the radio. And what I always say is, because it was never established that there was any mass panic. That was just something that people were reassured that just shows you. All right, what I always say is we should worry far more about the people who need to be in control. If they keep fronting this kind of stuff, like, you know, we don't watch you for a minute and you're going out doing something crazy. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, now here's another one. This is much more modern. This is more 1960s. Dolphins learn to talk. Carl Sagan. Does anybody here remember Carl Sagan, the astronomer? Anyway, he was part of this. It's a long story. I do tell some of it. But the basic message, which everybody in that line of work was anxious to hear, was humans are not exceptional. With proper training, a big-brained animal like the dolphin can be taught human language. No. Not only wasn't it true, but it was quite harmful to the dolphins. Because the difficulty is if human beings take an animal like a dolphin, so get it away from other dolphins, lives with humans for years and years, what's going to happen? That would be like letting your dog go in a northern wilderness in Canada, thinking he'll meet up with a wolf pack and be fine. If he met up with a wolf pack, he'd be torn to pieces, right? And the dolphins on which these experiments were done generally did poorly after that because they were not really fit for dolphin society and it just didn't work well with humans. And no, they did not learn to communicate human language. They did not speak Dolphinese. Oh, Carl Sagan was learning Dolphinese. Yeah, that's a story people sometimes tell, but mostly don't tell because these are all supposed to be the really smart people, smarter than you or me, right? And they fell for all this stuff. Oh yeah, and there was a lot of LSD involved. You know, LSD? Yeah, that's what ended the experiment. The guy in charge, who probably shouldn't have been in charge, was giving LSD to the dolphins. Not humane, not smart. Okay, well, all right, so that's yes, yes, so long and thanks for all the fish, as it says in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reality is it wasn't happening. Now here's another one that wasn't happening. Again, cruelty to animals, if you ask me. Chimpanzees can learn to talk. They are just like people. No. The message was supposed to be humans are not exceptional. argue that one however you want, but the big experiments to show that chimpanzees can talk just like people went nowhere. The big lab that was doing it in Iowa State in the United States ended up being put under new management, and they went back to studying the chimpanzees as chimpanzees. The whole thing was pretty crazy, though, if you actually sit down and read what happened, including horrible attacks by chimpanzees on humans. I mean, remember, these are chimpanzees, right? And but anyway, and here's the part of the story I found most interesting. There were papers in the literature claiming that chimpanzees could think like people. Nobody questioned them, but nobody followed up on it either. Think about that one for a minute. If I told you space aliens landed in the parking lot outside my building here in Victoria, well, you'd expect to hear more, wouldn't you? Instead, it's just drive-by information. You never hear about it again. Isn't it more likely that the space aliens didn't land? Okay, in the same way, we're told we've shown that chimpanzees can think like people. Next topic. Next topic after that. Wait a minute. I don't think it happened, but it wasn't in the interests of people in the primate study faculties to directly address this. So they just let it sink, into the sea of papers. But we know from their subsequent behavior what they really did, which is they put that lab under new management. So again, when you hear in the popular media or psychology lectures that chimpanzees can be taught to think like people, remember this story. They won't tell you maybe, but I will. I got nothing to lose. I don't work there. Okay, now here's another big one about why human beings are not exceptional. Computers will soon think like people, right? We hear that all the time. The biggest proponent of that had said it was going to be in 2029. That'd be Ray Kurzweil in the States. He's since revised it to 2040. In my view, he should revise it up to the year mega zilch, right? It's not going to happen. See, here's the problem. This, by the way, I do this for a living. One of the publications for which I work as an editor is about this very thing, among other things, artificial intelligence. What do computers do? They compute. That's what it is. It computes. Now, many elements of human intelligence are not computational. We don't arrive at what we know by computing. Now, sometimes a computer can be got to handle the same tasks by computing as humans might do by something else. But there's a limit to how well that will work, because it probably won't work for everything. So if I had no other reason for thinking it was never going to happen, that would be my reason. And most of what people claim, what I do is I send it round to experts and they come back to me and say, no, they didn't do what they're claiming to do. There are ways, as you all know, because you work in academia, of phrasing something that makes it look like you did it. But a person examining it carefully will say, no, wait, they didn't do that. Okay. So, but you're going to be hearing lots and lots of these stories. Now, every so often, I'm glad to say, one of these myths actually gets confuted. Maybe not systematically, maybe not eternally, but there gets to be serious pushback against the myth. That happened in the case of drug addicts. The United States was involved in a war in Vietnam, as we all know, in the 60s and 70s. And at one point, there was a huge foreseen problem that about 100,000 American soldiers were going to come back from Vietnam who were addicted to heroin. Vietnam was basically a hellhole for them. Heroin was easily available, and that's how they would get addicted. Well, you can imagine what people would think would happen if 100,000 heroin addicts were suddenly dumped again in society. And so various plans were made to do big things to ward off the threat. But nothing much happened. And there's some interesting books written on it. One of them was Brainwashed that I've noted below. Most addicts quit without help. The main reason I'm suspecting, I'm no expert, but after they got back to the United States, their lives completely changed back to what they were used to. Getting involved with heroin would have meant getting involved with street criminals, maybe getting arrested. Basically, they just got over it. Some people, it's true, did need help. There were certainly people who were badly damaged by their experiences in Vietnam, not denying that, but the big crisis never happened. The significant thing was that people wrote about the fact that it didn't happen. What can we learn from the fact that it didn't happen? Well, the reality, which isn't in some people's interests, but it is in ours, so we might as well talk about it. There is free will, and people can change when they choose something that they want more than the addiction. In fact, that's what addiction counselors today say. They say you have to want something more than drugs or alcohol or gambling or whatever you're doing. And then you can change. Okay, so it was nice to see one of these myths confuted finally, because it was much better for people to know the truth. All right. Here's another one that actually got confuted. There was this researcher named Diederik Stapel, a person, from what I can gather, of indifferent honesty. I don't know very much of the story, so I'm not going to tell that part. But a number of this person's papers had to be retracted. One of the most fashionable and widely reported was that messy waiting rooms, untidy waiting rooms, promote racism. Now, exactly why that should be true is unclear to me, but okay, let's talk about it. It wasn't replicated, and it turns out the data was largely made up. What I would suggest is anytime it's a fashionable, hot-button topic like racism or religion, and edgy explanations are offered, be cautious. See, fraud is more likely when a result is edgy than when it's boring. If I did a big study, not that I'm qualified, and told you that cigarette smoking is bad for people's health, I'm probably telling the truth, but so have zillions of other researchers. The problem is some people want to smoke anyway. So that's not an edgy discovery. But if I do a study saying religious people are more likely than others to commit mass murder, be cautious. It's probably not true. But it may suit some people's agenda to puff the thing up. And I've seen so much of that in the last 5 decades. Okay. Final thoughts. Myths exist for a reason, because they teach people about life, specifically what the myth maker wants them to learn about life. Materialist myths teach people about life from a materialist perspective. There's no free will. The government needs to run everybody's life. All religions are a sham. Religious people are worse than other people, and so forth. Okay, all false, but you can always find a myth that promotes it. And when you look into a lot of these myths, no surprise, you start to find out that, wait a minute, where did this information come from? Oh, wait, that's not working. That's all I mean. So one thing I think we need to do more of is help people see beneath the myths to the fact. In the examples I provided here, that was done. But there are many myths out there that it hasn't been done for yet. If you keep an eye on them, you might find one that you can work on. And from anything I can tell, it's a lot of fun. Well, like I say, good luck. And that concludes my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.